Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this somewhat unusual edition of Songwriting Simplified with me, Jonny Lipsham. Unfortunately, Johnny Guy cannot be with us tonight. I believe he announced kind of a lot of the reason why on his show last night. I'm just going to turn this down just a little bit more. There we go. Oh, there we go. So yeah, I believe Johnny announced a lot of the reason why. Hang on, I've forgotten to turn my phone off. We can't have that beeping at us all the way through the show. There we go, that's that job done. So yes, I believe Johnny informed everybody as to a lot of the reason why it's just me doing the show tonight. Which I'm totally fine with. Sometimes needs must. And this is one of them. I have heard from Johnny. He's at the hospital, and he's been undergoing some tests to figure out what's going on with his breathing and all of that. He's okay. He's fine. I believe he's home. Excuse me, I've got a real itch. I believe he's home, and he's okay. He's doing fine. But yeah, there's not really a whole lot to tell, to be honest, other than he's had some tests. We don't know what the results are yet, but everything seems to have gone pretty well, and I believe they discharged him. And I guess once we have the results back, we'll know a little bit more. So I guess he and I, between us, will keep you guys informed and updated. But so far, so good, and, you know, in some respects, no news is good news. So, you know, they haven't spotted anything immediately life-threatening or serious. So that's pretty cool. All right. So the piece of music that you're listening to just now is a piece that I mocked up. Well, I didn't really mock it up. It's so it's a piece of music bed music that I wrote for a client to go behind a commercial that they did, and they asked me for 5 minutes of music at a very specific tempo, and so this is what I came up with. It's essentially a blues in A, mostly because I can only solo on guitar in A, but he specifically wanted guitars, and he didn't really give me a whole lot of time to do it, so that's what I came up with. So there you go. I hope you enjoyed it. And I'll maybe play a little bit more of that later if I can find the track, because I've just closed that window. That was clever of me. All right, so anyway, welcome to Songwriting Simplified. Now, because this is kind of a little bit unplanned, I wasn't really sure what Johnny and I were going to do when I spoke to him earlier on in the week. We usually have a little session where we sit and think about what we might do for Songwriting Simplified. And sometimes we just don't really have a clue, and we just decide, hey, let's just do a show and we'll wing it and see what people's questions are. And so that's kind of largely what we're going to talk about today, really, is kind of your questions and your thoughts and your feelings on a range of subjects that maybe you provide. I've got a couple of ideas that we could maybe talk a little bit about working with songs that have no chord changes. So we can talk about that. Songs with no chord changes, vamps, and that kind of stuff, and how to keep those kind of songs engaging and interesting. There are a lot of songs out there that you know have just, they don't really have a lot going, really, you know, in terms of lots, you know, there's not really a whole lot of chord changes. Some songs only have one, maybe two chord changes. So we can talk about that, like the one that immediately springs to mind. In fact, there's two. There's Steely Dan's The Fez. There's not a whole lot going on there. It's mostly a groove, vamp-orientated song. And really the feature is the organ and synth melody that goes in between the vocal sections. And that's what keeps the interest there. And the other song really would be The Horse with No Name. Angel by Jeff Beck is another great one. But yeah, Horse with No Name is really good. Again, what keeps the listener engaged is the hook of the song, which is the melody that has no lyrics to it in that song. And that's really the bit that everyone hangs their hat on. So if you're going to write a song that only has a couple of chord changes or is more groove orientated, then that's one way to do it. So how would you approach that? Well, you could just have literally just one chord or two chords. Like Horse with No Name is, fairly simple. It's pretty much like chord 1 to chord 5 in a minor key. So there's various ways in which you can do that. And the Fez is kind of also a variation on that. It's kind of like a 2-5-1 in a minor key that just keeps going round. But it does have like this little middle section in it that has a few more chord changes that, again, those are kind of devices that just kind of keep you engaged in the song. But fundamentally, it's just, just like one little thing. So there is another approach you can take, and that is to use modes. Now, what do we mean by modes? Well, modes are based out of the Gregorian system from like the Middle Ages. So we're talking like the 12th, 13th century. And it's kind of like added to and developed a little bit, but you end up with essentially scales that are derived from just the white notes of the keyboard, which you can then obviously transpose once you've worked out what those scales are. You can take the construction of that scale, so the intervallic relationship in that scale, and you can transpose that about. I'll show you that in just a minute as well. So that's another approach that you can take, where everything is built around a scale rather than a set of chord changes. So that could be a major scale, that could be blues, that could be a diminished scale, it could be a whole tone scale. I've written songs that are based around the whole tone scale, and they're great fun to do, and they're great fun to play on. I wrote a piece for a film which was based around the diminished whole tone scale because I wanted it to kind of be quite dark but have no sense of tonality to it either, but I didn't want it to be atonal. So my brief was fairly specific. Don't want it to be atonal, but want it to be dark, but also have no real sort of grounding tonality-wise. So he wanted it to be not major or minor, but he didn't want it to be atonal either. So I was kind of like, okay, what am I going to do? So I had to be a little bit creative. So I started going through some obscure scales that I know, and I know some very obscure scales. I know some Indian talas and ragas, and they are really, really useful for that kind of thing. I could have used a hexachordal scale. That's getting into some seriously advanced stuff using hexachordal scales. I could have used negative harmony if you're aware of the English musical genius that is Jacob Collier. He very much is into negative harmony, and that's a whole nother subject that is probably way over the head of most people. So we won't be going there. So we'll talk a little bit about modes and that kind of stuff, because modes are fairly easy. Get into maybe one or two of them, and you've got plenty of mileage there to write a few songs out of, and then you can kind of do some research and learn some more of them. There are, I think there are 7 minor modes and 7 major modes, and the most common ones are the minor modes, and those are the ones that we're going to talk about tonight. So kind of like, yes, it's still songwriting, and it is still songwriting simplified. We're just coming up with another way in which you can write a song that doesn't necessarily involve going and sitting down and working out, okay, I'm going to need to work out some chord changes here. This kind of like throws chord changes out of the window and instead you take the notes from the scale to make your chords. And the cool thing is the chords don't have to actually logically progress. So, you're using a chord as a sound or a mood rather than something that has to progress and voice lead and everything else to make sense with the next chord, like we would normally do in standard music. In standard, pop song, you would have, C, A minor, D minor, G. Hundreds of thousands of songs have been written out of that set of chord changes. So, we're going to avoid doing that. And instead of having a chord that makes sense in that kind of context, we're going to be building chords out of a scale, and where each chord doesn't have to relate to the next one. Okay? Now that kind of sounds like a huge concept that is probably, again, going to challenge your thinking a little bit, and you're probably thinking, how is this simplified? Well, it's simplified in that you don't have to think about chords anymore. You just think about plucking a few notes out of the scale, putting them together, and making some interesting sounds. So, that's kind of where we're coming from with this. So how do we work out what these are? So I'm going to talk about 2 modes. And that's it. And I'm going to leave the rest to you to kind of go and do some Googling and some research and some listening. Okay? So the 2 modes that I'm going to show you, one is called the Dorian mode. See, all of these, they have kind of Greek sounding names or Latin sounding names. Don't ask me why, they just do. You've got to give a name to something. And, the Gregorian music theorists at the time of that Middle Ages period, they applied Latin names to pretty much everything. They probably even gave their toilet a Latin name. Or toilet paper a Latin name, for example. And that's one for Dooley Still right there, if he's here. So in just a sec, we'll get into that. So let's go up and have a look at who is here, and then we'll get into moods. So let's see. Mika's asking if there's anywhere from Jonny. Yep, I addressed that at the start. Buster says, solo is fine, pat yourself on the back. Thank you very much. Yeah, it's not a great guitar solo because I'm not a great guitar player. It could have been a screaming blues solo, but I don't do screaming blues solos on any instrument, really. Just Bob says, top of the morning. I am half Irish, but it's not the morning. Well, it kind of is, I suppose. It's kind of after midnight. Yeah, I suppose that makes it the morning. Major thirds in the solo. Yeah, it was. It's funny, Busty, you should mention major thirds, because in a blues, I like to put major thirds. Like if it's a minor blues, and we're using minor chords. So it's a minor blues, which is a bit of a darker blues than your regular dominant blues. I like to use major thirds as well as minor thirds. Yes, they clash. Like if it's a minor chord, here's your minor chord. I like to do this. It just kind of provides a little bit of extra tension and dissonance. And I like to do the opposite on major chords. So on a major chord, sometimes I'll play minor thirds. It's something I actually learned from listening to a great sax player called Eric Dolphy. And he does that a lot. On a minor chord, he'll do an arpeggio of a major chord and vice versa. And I thought, I like the sound of that. So I adopted the idea. So there we go. Let's see what else we have here. Just Bob asks, are there any scales that are not used anymore, considered a dead language in the musical world? Not really. I think everything is pretty much fair game. Even music that is ancient, like pre-Middle Ages. Even that music is fair game. Yes, there are some scales that don't get used so much anymore. But I don't think they're necessarily dead. I think it's more that we just we have developed those scales further. So pre the Middle Ages, pre the 1730s, or even pre the 1630s, I should say, before the Baroque period, there were not really clearly defined major and minor scales as we know them today. They didn't really exist quite so much before the Baroque era, kind of like the medieval period. And then you get into the Baroque era when kind of all of that starts coming about, and then, of course, you have the 12-tone chromatic scale and exactly equal temperament, which basically means the distance between one semitone and the next is exactly equal, regardless of where you are in range of a keyboard instrument, which is kind of where it developed. So everything is exactly mathematically equal. That kind of came into being kind of in the Baroque period. So some scales kind of died a death, I suppose, at around that time, just simply because with equalizing the interval of a semitone, because essentially on keyboard instruments of that period, the lower down the instrument you went, the larger the interval of a semitone got. So everything was a little bit flatter in terms of pitch, as we'd refer to it today. The lower you went, and then the higher you go up the keyboard, the smaller that interval of a semitone got. So, nothing was equal. So the higher the keyboard was, it was sharper than the bottom of the keyboard, which basically meant you couldn't do this. You could not do that on a Baroque clavier, which is a precursor to the piano. You just couldn't do that. They would not sound the same. Those are two C's several octaves apart. But they wouldn't sound the same. The interval would be slightly bigger. So I guess some scales kind of died a death with equal temperament coming along. So anyway, and of course with equal temperament came major and minor tonality as we know it today. And then, of course, you move into, after the Baroque period, you move into classical period, and so on and so forth. And I'm not going to give you a music history lesson. But yeah, I hope that answers that question, because I would like to hold all of my listeners here, if I can. Dorian is fun, all the white keys indeed. That is correct. Yes, I'm going to get onto that just now, actually. So, the Dorian mode, as Bop Studios has correctly alluded to, the Dorian mode is essentially playing all the white notes from D to D. So it kind of sounds like a minor scale, right? Because it has that minor third in it, kind of 1, 2, flat 3. So it has that minor kind of sound. So it kind of has that minor feel to it. But as you go further up the scale, that's where it kind of gets a little bit different. When you get to this B, it gets a little bit different. Okay? So it kind of has that, the Dorian mode has that darker minor sound to it. And it's really, really great for that, because you can play a lot of blues music using the Dorian scale, to be honest. And I have done quite a lot. When I'm playing a blues, I don't just play the blues scale, which I could do. Blues scale fits in blues, obviously. But you can also use... You can use that Dorian mode really quite nicely as well. Okay, so the Dorian mode is D to D on the white keys. And of course, once you work out the relationship between the intervals, you can also then transpose it around and have the same mode starting on a different note. And that's easy enough to do. So essentially you have from D, you go up a tone to E, so that's an interval of a tone. Then D to E is a semitone. F to G is a tone. G to A is a tone. A to B is a tone. And then B to C is a semitone. And then the C to the octave above is a tone. So it has that kind of construction, which basically means now that you know that, you can move that around. So let's say we start that same scale on, let's start it on B flat. So let's transpose the whole thing down a tone. So we're going to be going B flat, C, there's my tone, semitone, tone, 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 semitone, tone. And it's exactly the same scale, but I've transposed it down a major third from... Can you hear how it sounds exactly the same? Okay, so that's the Dorian mode. The other mode that we can talk about is the Mixolydian mode, which again is great for blues. Okay, and the Mixolydian mode is the same kind of scale, except this time instead of using D to D, you use G to G. So this time we'd be going G, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. So it kind of sounds like a major scale because you've got the major third. Alright, so you definitely got that kind of sense of a major kind of tonality coming through. Now, what makes this scale a little bit different is it's like the major scale, except instead of having the major 7, which would be the F sharp in the key of G, we flatten that 7 to the F. Okay, so this is really, really great for blues. It's really, really great for playing bebop and that kind of thing. So it works really, really well for jazz. It works well for blues. It works well for pop music. And again, you don't have to think about chords and those kind of relationships. So now that we know our two scales, our Dorian scale and our Mixolydian scale, Mike, I'll come on to that question in just a minute, buddy. But it is a great question. A phrase I heard recently, what does it mean to resolve a note or progression? We will come on to resolving things at the end, okay? So now that we know our scales, what this means is that we can take some of the notes of the scales and some of the notes of the scale, and we can put them together to create chords. Now, you can take, for example, here's a good one. Take a second inversion F major chord if we're going to work on Dorian mode. So this is basically where you have the C in the bass, the C is the lowest note, C, F, and A. Okay. And then what we're going to do is we're going to put, with this finger, we're going to put a G at the bottom. And now that creates this nice open kind of sounding sound. Yeah, this nice open sounding sound. It doesn't sound major, it doesn't sound minor, it sounds different. And what we're going to do is we're going to take this and we're going to move it around stepwise. And it has this nice open sound that that you can create little vamps out of. So, you could do this. And that works really nicely in a kind of Dorian mode kind of context. And the same with the Mixolydian context as well. You can create all sorts of different things. So if I move this bass line down to G, and all of a sudden you have something that sounds very, very different, and you're not worrying about, okay, I need to go chord 1 to chord 4 to chord 5 to chord 6 to chord, oh, hang on a minute, I need to do a turnaround, I need to go a 3, 6, 2, 5, 1, and I'm back again. With this, you're not thinking like that at all anymore. You're not thinking about C major to A minor to D minor to G7. You're not thinking that way at all. You're thinking about taking notes from the scale and playing them and finding out how they fit. Sometimes you'll find notes that fit really well together, and sometimes you'll find notes that just clash. And that's half the fun of using a scale to make your chords. So, for example, let's just pick some notes at random. Let's go for an E and an F. Gives you that nice semitone dissonance, and a B and a C at the top. That kind of sounds ugly on its own, but let's move this up around kind of stepwise. Some of those sound better than others, but what this means is, this is one of the ways in which Alan Holdsworth, the guitarist from Soft Machine, who then went on and had a relatively glittering career of his own as a solo artist in his own right, he was a guitar genius, and influenced a whole bunch of guitarists, including Slash from Guns N' Roses, and all sorts of great guitar players. Pat Metheny were very much influenced by Alan Holdsworth and his legato style. But he would derive. This is how he worked out chords for his songs, which is why they sound so open, and you can't really tell, is this a major or a minor? So this is kind of a different way of thinking about music, a different way of thinking about writing a song. Is instead of thinking about logical chord progressions, we're now thinking about kind of making something that just has a sound all of its own and doesn't need to go anywhere. I mean, you could just stay on, this kind of, you could just stay like this for ages, you could come up with those kind of things just by pulling out notes from notes from the scale to make interesting sounding chords. So that's really how you go about creating harmony, creating chord progressions, creating vamps out of using a scale. And it does mean you can open up your whole song to other influences, like, you can make your music a little bit more improvisational. Pink Floyd loved using modes. Steely Dan used them quite a lot. Like, for example, did I really just say for example? With a significant accent, I did not mean to do that. For example, the song Green Earrings starts off with this... and then it kind of goes, and kind of the verse is kind of built out of that little vamp, and then they move that vamp around into the kind of the chorus of the song. Sorry. And so on. I'll get stung for copyright for carry on playing that tune. But it's a darn great tune. I mean, there's a perfect example of a song that is created using a mode to create an atmosphere, to create a groove that the listener can really lock into. Alrighty, so now that we've kind of got out all that kind of stuff, I'm now going to address Mike's question. A phrase I've heard recently, what does it mean to resolve a note or a progression? So, going back to major, take two and action. Going back to major and minor tonality, a way out of the modal kind of thing that we've just been talking about. In the major and minor tonality system of major scales and minor scales, major chords, major keys, minor keys, everything has to resolve. You have tension and resolution. That's what makes the major and minor system work. And that's why it's worked for, over 1,000 years. Is because you have that system of tension and release. So, for example, if I was to play a G7 chord, now you've got two pieces of tension in this G7 chord. You have the seventh of the chord, and you have the major third, which is the interval of a tritone. There's three whole tones between the F and the B, and these two notes are desperately wanting to resolve this way. Okay, so this is loaded with the most tension in contemporary music, classical music for the last 1,000 years. This is the most loaded with tension thing that there is in music, because it's got to go somewhere, and logically it wants to go to 1, chord 5 to chord 1. Okay, now the chord precedes that is going to be a minor chord, D minor, G7 to C. Okay? Now, you can delay that resolution for as long as you want. And great classical musicians and composers have done that. J.S. Bach was the master of delaying resolutions. He would hang the tension over the bar line, and he invented something that we just now call suspension. So when you talk about, hey, I'm playing a G sus4 chord there, or I'm playing a G sus2 chord there in this particular song, you only have that because of Bach. Bach invented that concept. The idea of delaying the resolution until much later. So, going back to our G7 to C, I can delay one of the tensions here. So the one I'm going to delay is the tension between the 7th resolving down to the 3rd of the C chord. I'm going to let the B go up and resolve to the C. And I've delayed that tension. And now I've resolved it. Okay? So we would call that a suspension. So we go G7, and now we've resolved it. We've gone. So we've let that 7th hang there, and it becomes the 4th of the new chord, and then you resolve that to the major 3rd. Or if you're really going to surprise somebody, you do this. And you go minor instead of major. It's a reverse tierce de Picardy, as they would say in French, the reverse Picardy 3rd, which is another kind of form of resolution that was popular in the late Baroque going into the classical period. And it got done to death a little bit by people like Handel. And so to the point where Mozart just said, I'm not going to do that Picardy 3rd nonsense because it's been done to death. So there you go. So that's kind of resolution. So popular music uses a lot more tension than classical music and a lot less resolution. So, for example, in a pop song, which has kind of, let's say, it's got some blues context to it a little bit, some blues ideas to it, but it's still a pop song, you can do this. You can do that, and you can vamp away on that G7 chord, kind of like playing with this this tension here. So you're adding tension, a little bit less tension, but that 7th is still there, desperately wanting to resolve its way down here to the C chord. But in a popular music context, you don't need to resolve that. You can just keep the tension there. Or you can resolve it, but add in another tension, which is where you'd go to the C chord. So if we're going to be like a blues. So we're kind of like dealing with a whole different idea of tension and release in popular music and jazz. Post 1960. Very good, Dooley Sill. Correct. But it's the perfect example of what we can do in popular music versus what you would do in classical music. In classical music, you'd have to resolve that pretty quick. Otherwise, your audience would start throwing rotten fruit at you, which you don't want. So I hope that answers your question, Mike, and I hope that that has answered everybody else's question. If you were thinking that and thinking, yeah, what is this resolution business all about? Well, that's what it's all about. So, that's why we have, chord progressions like 3-6-2-5-1. Basically, what is a 3-6-2-5-1? Chord 3 in C is E minor. So basically 3, 6, 2, 5, 1. Basically E minor 7, A7, D minor 7, G7 to C. And all of that is just basically tension, resolution, tension, resolution, tension, resolution, and home on C. So that's how that works. And all popular song is derived around those kind of ideas. 2-5-1s, 3-6-2-5-1s, or blues, 1-4-5, chord changes, all of that kind of stuff. That's where popular music is. And all of that, came out of probably the late teens, so basically the end of World War I, that kind of period when popular song was and music hall traditions were beginning to develop. That's where that kind of comes from. So yeah, So popular song from the music hall tradition lays the foundation for a much later idea, which is the concept of the musical. Vaudeville and music hall grow up together, and then you get into musicals, and now we have all sorts of musicals. I'm pretty sure for goodness sake, we now have Jerry Springer the musical. What's going to be next? Donald Trump the musical? I don't know. We have the Queen musical, which is fantastic, by the way. If you've never been to see it, go see it. It's awesome. Just Bob says, when you resolve tension with another tension, what is that called? It's more tension, dude. That has to resolve. Or not. It's up to you how much tension you are prepared to have in your music. And again, is that justifiable? How do you answer that question? Well, what is your lyric? Your lyric will tell you how much tension there should be harmonically in your song, or melodically in your song. So if your lyric is dark, or you've got friction between two personalities in your narrative, you can use lots of tension and not necessarily resolve much of it. And essentially the harmony will help to undergird the narrative of your song and help you develop the characters that you've got within your song. That's why music should always go hand in glove with the lyrics. I know there's a lot of you out there that you like to write your music first and then your lyrics afterwards. I do that as well. Some of you the other way around. Some of you like to write your lyrics because you like to have a sense of kind of the poetry of it. And then you kind of develop your music afterwards. Well, again, use the lyrics to create the atmosphere. And then think, okay, is there tension here? If there is tension here, how am I going to highlight that musically? You could use dissonance. You could use that interval there. That's the most dissonant thing. Or you could use semitones. Or you could use chords that don't belong in the key to create that tension. You could if your song is very nice and plain Jane kind of C. You could spice it up a little bit. And change the mood on the flip of a coin, just like that. So what did I do there? It's kind of improvised a little bit, but what did I do there? C, and then I went to a chord that doesn't belong, E7, E. But instead of it being a regular E, I did E with the flat 9, so I had the F natural at the top instead of the E. Now that normally leads you to an A minor chord. But instead, I used it to resolve somewhere else. So not only was the E with the flat 9 chord unexpected, I then went to an unexpected place again. So I went C, E flat 9, to F, and then D with F sharp in the bass, but with a suspended second, to give it a little bit of extra tension and a sense of openness. And then I went to G with the sus4, which I then resolved, and then I put the 7th at the top, and then I suspended the 7th to create a suspended 4, and then instead of resolving to the major where I was to start with, I went minor. Okay, so if my lyric is kind of like in a happy place and then it kind of goes sad, that would be justifiable. The harmony would support that kind of lyric, and kind of help create that image, which is what you have in film score. That's what film score does. Film score basically takes what you see and reinforces it with something you can hear, and something you can feel emotionally. So if there's an emotional scene of maybe the main character is dying, then the music will be dark and will maybe take the central melodic theme that is identified with that character and make that minor. And then what that does is that invokes an emotional response in you to what you're seeing on the screen. Take away the music, and that scene loses a lot of its impact. The same with your lyrics in your song, okay? Make sure that the lyric of the song and the music marry so well together that the music is always supporting the lyric. So they have this kind of symbiotic relationship, okay? And that's where kind of these harmonic ideas that we've talked about, you know, the modal stuff, the suspensions, how you can add a little bit of extra tension and then resolve it in a different way. That's where those kind of ideas can help you, just give you a whole bunch of extra tools to your toolkit to write your song. So Mike says he's got to go. I'll see you around. Well, I hope that more than answers your question, Mike. Very good to see you and very good to have you in here. We've got 25 people in here, which is awesome. Lollipop Guild says, nice weather today, isn't it? You know what? It's been absolutely gorgeous here as well in Scotland. It's been the hottest day of the year so far. I think it was like 25 degrees Celsius here, which is going to be like, I suppose, mid to late 80s, I think, if I've done my maths right. Lollipop Guild says, power notes hitting the power words. Exactly right. And Jas has just walked in the door. And yes, he has observed I am on my own. There is no giant guide tonight. So there's a little bit less banter. So I'm sorry about that. But hopefully next week, normality will be restored. I'll keep you updated on Jonny's situation. And as he alluded to at the end of his show last night, he may be taking a break from live streams for a little while. You know, kind of, I think his health kind of needs that, but I guess we'll see what we'll see. I've been trying to suggest to him that a rest is a good idea. But, you know, I know how much he enjoys hanging out with you guys and how much he enjoys doing his live streams. He loves it. He really loves doing it. It's not a chore to him. It's not a job to him. It's fun doing the live streams. And I appreciate that. But, you know, we need to have Jonny healthy. So, you know, I think a break would do him a lot of good. But I also think it might even help make his shows even better, because he'll have had a little bit of time away from it, a little bit more time to think about the show and how he can improve it and tweak it and hone it. So we'll see. What will fill the gap? I'm not entirely sure. Maybe I'll do some more streams. I don't know. I've not decided that yet. Just Bob with the $10 donation. Just Bob, thank you so very much. I very much appreciate that. You guys are excellent, awesome people. Mika Han says, HST live stream is JG's therapy. Absolutely. And he's said that on a number of occasions, and I don't disagree with that. It is his relaxation time. He does enjoy doing it, but, you know, I know that it also takes a lot out of him as well. So, you know, ultimately his health has to come first, I think, and doing the right thing by his health will mean that he is able to serve the HST community for longer, I think. But it is up to him. It's his decision. He's old enough to, ugly enough to make his own choices in life. So, you know, I take that under advisement. But, you know, that's been my advice to him. So there you go. Let's see. What else do we have here? Any more questions, guys? Because we've got about 5 minutes left. I would like to go right up to the wire today. And then the next few days for me are going to be phenomenally busy. Phenomenally busy. So you may not see me around in the groups quite so much over the next few days. Because I am just going to be absolutely... it's going to be like 21 hour days for the next 4 or 5 days. For a variety of reasons that I cannot talk about. Mostly to do with client confidentiality. So yeah, Lollipop Guild says yes, he's still paying a price for energy he needs for more important personal things. Yeah, I think there's a degree of truth to that as well. Anyone got a burning question that on songwriting that maybe something they're struggling with that they would like an answer to? I will absolutely answer the very next question that comes in. So get typing, guys. Buster with the question says, how would you recommend bridging the gap between educated players and those that just hear and play by feel? Great question. I would recommend, I'd actually recommend doing a lot of listening. Doing a lot of listening to great music and at the same time doing some research and, just figuring things out. Listening to your favorite records and working out what makes them good. What makes those songs really good? What makes a song like Green Earrings such a great song? What makes a song like Tea House on the Tracks really good is, they've got certain elements to them that you can hang your hat on. So how do you identify those things by ear? You identify those things by ear by kind of knowing a little bit about how music works. And we've talked about tension and release. And that's essentially what makes music work. Tension and release. You hear it in the drum beat, in a straight ahead, pop beat. It's the tension between the kick drum and the snare drum. That's what makes it work. Kind of like the snare drum being on the weak beats on the 2 and the 4 is resolved by, or counterbalanced by having the kick drum on 1 and 3. It provides that forward motion. Essentially that drum beat comes from kind of a marching band context originally anyway. So, there's that's what gives it that sense of forward motion. So, bridging the gap between people that don't know that kind of stuff and people that just play by feel. I have my feet in both camps. Because whilst I'm very much a self-taught musician and a self-taught musicologist and a self-taught musical theorist and historian, I'm all of those, but I've never sat down and done any detailed study lesson. I've never studied with anybody. Yes, I went to university, but I did audio engineering and I studied jazz composition. But I didn't really set out to study musicology at university. I spent a lot of time listening to records and sitting down at the piano trying to work out what it was I was hearing that I liked, that really grabbed me. That's and then trying to work out the relationship between the notes. So, hearing a great sounding set of chords, like any time I listen to Bill Evans play the piano, I hear beautiful chord voicings. I was just like, gosh, those chords sound absolutely gorgeous. What are they? What are those chords? So I'd sit down at the piano and try and pick out some of the notes of these glorious chord voicings that he would play. And then I was like, okay, now that I can play some of those voicings, what is it about these voicings that make it sound so darn good? That way I can say to somebody else, hey, in this song of mine, I want you to play this chord. And they are able to understand what that is. So I needed to sit down and work out the relationship between one note and the next in those chords, in any one of those Bill Evans chords. And by that I could work out how do I communicate that chord to somebody else and get them to play the same thing, whether they can read music or not. Even if they can't read music, actually that's more important. If they don't read music, I do, but I don't read music very well. My wife, she reads flypaper. My dad reads double-sided flypaper. I'm not that good. I can't, somebody can't just slap a really complicated horn section part in front of me and say, right, get your flugelhorn out and play that. I have to listen to the context. I have to, work the intervallic relationships out with my ears, and then I can play it. I have a couple of hoops to jump through before I get to being able to play what's on the chart. But then once I can play what's on the chart, I can nail it every single time, without fail. I have my feet in both camps, the musical theory and the application. Of kind of playing by feel, playing by, hey, does this sound good? Yes, this sounds good. Great, let's do it. So I hope that answers your question. Just Bob says, tempo is set on the music sheet. I can see trying to pull music for feel. The feel comes, Lollipop Girl says, the feel comes after playing what's on the sheet. For a beginner that doesn't play it right the first time, practice brings it out. Yeah, and also listening to other people that you're working with. I mean, in a kind of solo practice context where you're at home and you're trying to work out the part that you've been given to play that you can then bring to rehearsal. Those kind of things. You can work some of those things out in your practice room, but you need also to be able to listen as well to other people or to a backing track and see how what you're playing fits in to the context of everything else. Buster says, tempo is subjective, so to speak, in classical. Who decides the retards, etc.? Well, actually, often tempo is fixed in classical music. Which is where BPM comes from. What does BPM stand for? Beats per minute. How has that worked out? It's worked out because we needed to have a fixed tempo so that everyone, in the orchestra, or that whole thing of somebody beating time goes way back to maybe at the very, very dawn of the Baroque period, where you're dealing with chamber groups of maybe 7, 8, 9, 10, 12 musicians. How are you going to get them all to play at the same time together? Somebody's got to mete out a tempo that everyone can stick to. That's what the conductor does. But back before there was a conductor, you had somebody with a stick, and he'd basically beat time with the stick on the floor. He'd pound the beat out on the floor. And that meant that everybody knew, how much time there is between one quarter note and the next one, or 1/8 note and the next one. And that meant that if somebody has 7/8 notes and an 1/8 note rest, but the person next to them has 4 quarter notes, now we can make those line up because somebody has the tempo, somebody has that. Now you can play with that. Tempo is fixed, but it's elastic. You can stretch it, you can compress it, you can do all sorts of this, and that's what conductors do. And that's what great solo piano players, when you see them playing something like Mozart's Third Piano Sonata, for example, not Mozart, Beethoven's Third Piano Sonata, you hear them playing elastically with the time. They stretch it out, then they ping it back, they stretch it out, and they ping it back. That's feel. That's emotion. But the tempo itself is always fixed, because that second movement of that sonata is dun 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 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It's that. So everyone knows that that's fixed. Why? Because the woodwinds are going da 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 da. But the piano player can stretch the melody out and go dun 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 dun. You know, they can really stretch out those quarter notes, whereas everyone else is playing da 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 da. So the conductor is responsible for making sure the woodwinds backing the soloist are playing nice, straight, in time, together, as one, whilst the piano player, the soloist, is stretching out and playing elastically with the melody and pinging it back. So there you go. So tempo is fixed. That's how we all played in time together. You know, somebody counts the band off you go. So, you know, it's one of my pet peeves is when you have a drummer that's a little bit inexperienced and they go 1, 2, 3, 4, dun, 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 and I'm expecting to play it 1, 2, 3, 4 because that's the tempo. But they don't see it like that. They just think, oh, you just count 4. You just count to 4 and then you play. Well, yeah, but you count to 4. That sets the tempo at which everybody's going to play. That's the whole point of counting to 4. You're not counting to 4 just because it sounds cool. You're counting to 4 because that is information to everybody else. This is the tempo that we play at. So there you go. Buster says BPM for sure, but the conductor is hammering that out. Yes. Back in the Baroque period, they'd be hammering it out, but no, they beat it with a specific hand gesture. But whilst he's doing that, he's also giving the orchestra some license to be flexible within that as well. Oftentimes, you know, something like, let's take the main title theme from Star Wars. That has a very militaristic kind of aspect to it. Or take Holst's The Planets. Take the first movement from that, which is Mars. Mars, the bringer of war, has a very strident dun 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 dun. It has that kind of sense to it. That's very kind of rigid. But then you go to the final movement of that work, which is Neptune, and it's all a little bit floating, a little bit airy. I've conducted Holst the Planets for my university orchestra, and the hardest one for me to conduct was Neptune. Why? Because it's still in 5/4, like Mars is, but the contrast is that everything is kaleidoscopic, everything is kind of shift. There's no real melody, particularly in Neptune. There's a little bit of melody, but not very much. It's kind of all done by suggestion, whereas in Mars, it's very, you know, in your face. Everything is loud in Mars, and everything is very upfront, and it hits you between the eyes. That's the idea of that music. So yes, you need the conductor as much in Neptune as you do in Mars, but for two different purposes. In Mars, it's about making sure everything is very rigid. In Neptune, it's making sure that everybody's phrases start and end together, and less about the beat, because there isn't really much of a beat involved there. Buster says, we're on the same page. The conductor could just start his metronome and go home. Well, not entirely. Not entirely, because one of the roles of the conductor is to make sure that everybody has their cues. Cues are very, very important in an orchestra. And now you could say, hey, lazy musicians, you don't need cues, you just need to make sure you count your bars correctly. Yes, true. You do need to make sure you count your bars correctly. But there's always that margin for error where you might miss a bar. Or you might count a bar twice. If you're the only one doing the counting, and you've miscounted, you come in on your cue a bar too soon on your timpani roll when you've got 2 piccolos and 2 flutes and an oboe and a bassoon playing, and they're playing nice and soft and quiet, and you come in with on your timpani. So the conductor is essential to make sure that that timpani player is cued so that he knows that he needs to be ready, because in 2 bars time he's going to be doing his role. Mika says, without a conductor, who will tell the orchestra when they're doing it wrong? Exactly. Can an orchestra play without the conductor? Yes. Big bands do it all the time. So you can have a large group of musicians play without a conductor. Difference is you have a drum set in a big band. You don't have that in an orchestra. Percussion in an orchestra is entirely for color, whereas in a big band it's essential sense of pulse. Anyway, we are 12 minutes overtime here, guys. So, but those are great questions to finish with. And we've kind of moved away from songwriting and into kind of conducting and orchestration and all of that, which is a fun little diversion. So I hope you have enjoyed tonight's solo version of Songwriting Simplified. And I'll be back again right here on this YouTube channel for Sunday Night Live this Sunday. It's going to be awesome. I've got some fun stuff to demonstrate and some fun stuff to talk about on Sunday Night Live. It's going to be great. So there we go. I hope you guys have enjoyed it, and hopefully we'll get Jonny back up and running and back into action pretty soon. All right, so that's it, folks. I will bid you a very good night. Good night. And I pressed that button too soon. Sorry. And I've lost my music. This is a great ending to the show. Good night, everybody.